Good afternoon, and welcome to the final presentation of the SAR Colloquium Series for the 2021 to 2022 academic year. My name is Paul Ryder, and I am the Director of Scholar Programs here at SAR, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome today's speaker. I also want to say special thanks to the Paloheimo Foundation, which has a foundation which has sponsored the fellowship for this speaker. Today's speaker is Adriana Linares-Palma, the 2021 to 2022 Paloheimo Fellow. Thank you to the Paloheimo Foundation. Adriana is a PhD candidate in the Department of Latin American Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. And her project while here at SAR is titled Ixil Political Geography During the Post-Classic Period, Approaches from Archaeological Knowledge and Ixil Ontologies. Please join me in listening to Adriana Linares-Palma's talk and welcoming her today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Adriana Maria Linares-Palma. It is an honor being part of this cohort of residents and a pleasure to share my work with you today. Thanks to the Paloheimo Foundation and to SAR for this wonderful opportunity. I want to thank also to my family, especially to my mother, Ana Dolores Palma, likewise to my dissertation committee, to my graduate professors, to the ancestral authorities of San Juan Cotzal, to the compares or spiritual guides, and to my friends. All of you have supported me to reach this point. I want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting on indigenous lands and pay our respects to the Tewa people and all the indigenous peoples who have and continue to be part of these lands and territories here on Turtle Island. Especially, I want to acknowledge to the Maya Ixil people who continue fighting for their territory and with whom I worked to complete my dissertation. Today, I'm sharing an excerpt of my forthcoming article entitled Entanglements of Archaeology and Spiritual Ways of Knowing, a work that is the product of a request that the Alcaldía Indígena, or the ancestral authorities of San Juan Cotzal, presented to me in 2013 for an archaeological research in their territory. In this presentation, first, I locate the context of a study and how my experience in Cotzal led me to address the implications of my work with a national historical level. Second, I am going to talk about linear time within a national scope. Third, I will address the Ixil nonlinear time as one of the channels of their resilience, and then I conclude with some final thoughts. The municipality of San Juan Cotzal forms part of the Ixil region, along with Santa Maria Nevaj at the west and San Gaspar Chahul at the north, in the Cuchumatanes Mountains, at the northern Maya highlands of Guatemala. Currently, there are 3 hydroelectric plants in operation in the Ixil region, built by multinational companies. The energy production capacity at Palo Viejo, the hydroelectric plant built in Cotzal, is the second largest energy producer in the country. Meanwhile, several communities adjacent to Palo Viejo do not have electricity and have been adversely affected by the construction of this mega project. The communities of Cotzal were not consulted before the construction of Palo Viejo in 2011, which deviated the natural course of the area's main rivers, affecting directly the balance of the ecosystem, the people's agricultural production, and the social fabric. It is important to mention this context because the ancestral authorities identified archaeological research as a resource to enhance their cultural and political objectives against these mega projects and support their social movement towards indigenous self-determination. After various years of dialogue and consultation with them, we agreed to elaborate an archaeological atlas of the post-classic and sacred sites of Cotzal using community-based methods. I argue that by joining this collaboration, we were able to integrate local ontologies within a mapping program, which contributes to a current political struggle demanding indigenous sovereignty. Such collaboration is illustrative of how the inclusion of decolonial, activist research and participatory methods pushes archaeology beyond academia. During my fieldwork research, I worked closely with the Ishil University, and participating in their activities was of significance to realize that I was ignoring a fundamental component of the Ishil history and past. I understood that instead of socializing the knowledge I learned through my career, I was imposing my Western understanding of Ishil history and leaving aside people's own conceptualization of time and past. The conversations among students of the Ishil University led me to see how I was maintaining the dynamics of knowledge production, knowing the past as an expert. These experiences were fundamental to challenge the conventional methods I learned during my academic formation, pushing me to reflect on the impacts of archaeological practices in Guatemala. The collaborative and participatory approach we conducted at Cotzal challenged me and pushed me to examine the roles that archaeological knowledge has had in the country, specifically to enhancing the national discourse of homogeneity in Guatemala that invisibilized local perspectives and managed the past as a commodity for the neoliberal markets of tourism. In response to this situation, some of the questions that I addressed in my research are: how does hegemonic perspectives erase diverse, multiple, and local approaches to conceptualizing the past? To what degree our practices are at the risk to perpetuate dominant narratives and coloniality? My research draws from the colonial theory, methods, and practices that emphasize collaboration between archaeologists and local communities. Also, I draw from indigenous archaeologists, Black feminist archaeology, intersectionality, and Maya feminist standpoints to discuss the politics of archaeological knowledge production in Guatemala. Local knowledge, such as that of the Ishil, has been excluded from the Guatemalan national history that continues to rely on Western scientific approach and its primacy of projects of global development, affecting indigenous communities in multiple ways. Specifically, I examine the tensions produced when the linear approach to time is used for hegemonic projects, which have silenced the multiplicity and diversity of forms of understanding and living in the world. On one hand, an archaeological understanding of time is linear, and it has been used as key part to build the Guatemalan nation. Its methods include excavations, which the Ishil people consider extractive. On the other hand, the Ishil conceptualization of time is non-linear, allowing for the constant connection of the past to the present through the practice of spirituality and memory. I underline the tension between these two opposed conceptualizations in order to visualize the power dynamics within the process of knowledge production. I argue that the linear use of time framed within Guatemalan national discourse presupposes a temporal distance between the indigenous present and the materiality of the archaeological sites. This temporal distance demarks a disconnection between the indigenous peoples and their history. Meanwhile, the Ixil nonlinear concept claims indigenous rights to protect their sacred places, their identity, their history, and territory, challenging the linear national prevalent discourses. To have a better picture of all of this, now I'm explaining the complexities of the linear time within nationalism and archaeology. And after, I will address on the Ixil non-linear time. The belief of the Maya civilization's disappearance is a normalized, deeply rooted belief about the people of Guatemala. When people not related to academic circles learn about my profession as an archaeologist, they frequently ask, why did the Maya disappear? Who were they? Who took or stole them? Where did they go? I have encountered these questions several times since I started with my studies. They are symptomatic of a bigger and more complex picture related to the origins of archaeological practice in direct relationship with the formation of the Guatemala nation-state, which relied on linear, evolutionary, racist, and paternalist narratives of the past. I give special attention to the construction and use of concepts of otherness regarding the indigenous peoples in Guatemala and how archaeology uses the linear clustering of time to theorize the past and time based on this premise. During the creation of the nation-state in Guatemala in the 19th century, concepts like savages and barbarian were used to target the indigenous peoples and to justify the need to civilize them concerning the development of the country. The elite intellectuals of the era contributed to shape Guatemalan nationhood, which assumes that all citizens are at the same, but at the cost of denying the indigenous past and culture. This ideology is linked to Western ideals of progress, driven by the economic society of friends who believe the quote-unquote Indians were delaying the progress of Guatemala and needed integration into modernity. For instance, in 1893, the government of Guatemala called for a scientific literary contest to celebrate the 4th centenary of the discovery of the Americas. The Ladino lawyer Antonio Batres Jauregui, member of the intellectual elite, presented a work entitled The Indians, Their History and Their Civilization, which won the contest. After a long narrative that explained the social problem of the Indians and targeted them as barbarous, he proposed methods to improve their situation and to justify civilizing them. Batres Jauregui stated, quote, coming to the point of the greatest advancement for the civilization of our Indians, it should be noted that the aboriginal culture was completely lost. Quiches and Cachiqueles reveal their past greatness, but they don't give a sample of it today, because the slightest spark of growth of that race alarmed the conquistadors. What is needed is that they develop. They are fed by the tradition of what they were. End quote. This excerpt demonstrates how the intellectuals promoted the ideology that the Mayas were in the past and their culture was completely lost. This work legitimized the disconnection of the indigenous communities from the Maya pre-Hispanic history, in which the quote-unquote Indians were not the same as the great Mayans found at the ruins. Batres Jauregui's paternalist, racist, and classist ideologies prevails today. A century later, the discourses from the same elite group keep appropriating the Maya past as the source for national pride. Similarly, the state and private institutions continue promoting and using the history of the Maya civilization as the basis of the nation state. This narrative praises the greatness of the Mayas as belonging to a remote past that is the ground for Guatemalans and that is unrelated to the contemporaneity of Maya and Xinca peoples that live in the country. This discourse is based on particular uses of linear and evolutionary perception of time interconnected with ideologies of otherness, as they were considered a quote-unquote problem for the advancement of modernity. In this process, archaeology played an important role that provided a scientific standpoint that intellectuals used to legitimize national ideology. Through archaeology, the Maya past became the basis of nationhood, and the ruins gave proof of the common monumental history of all Guatemalans. This is what Johannes Fabian called the denial of coevalness, as the way in which the anthropological other is justified by the cultural relativism of societies into other isolated times, such as primitive, savage, or uncivilized. Under the paradigm of evolutionism, the conception of time also implied the affirmation of difference as distant past, where the Maya civilization are no longer in existence. An example of the complexities of national pride is at the bicentennial festivities of Guatemalan independence from Spain. In February of this year, the government inaugurated activities to officially celebrate the bicentennial. Among all the institutional protocols and ceremonies across the country, it was of particular interest the celebration at Izimche, the last Cachiquel citadel and one of the archaeological sites promoted as the cultural heritage for the nation. There was a stage decorated with Maya glyphs, resembling carved stone, and behind it a Guatemalan flag projected over one of the main buildings of Izimche. The stage served for dances and music by the modern and folkloric ballet of Guatemala and the National Symphony Orchestra. The exoticized show included actors disguised as jaguars, monkeys, quetzals, bats, Maya kings with tunics, loincloths, and large headdresses. The Minister of Culture, Felipe Aguilar, stated, quote, "Today we are all Guatemala. We are all independent, free. Today we are all responsible for building the Guatemala where we all want to live," end quote. Meanwhile, Alejandro Yamatei, the president of the country, said, quote, "With so much natural and cultural wealth that we have, it is essential to recognize culture as an engine of economic development and a facilitator of sustainable development," end quote. These statements reinforce a multicultural neoliberal framework which integrates diversity in discourse, but it is a facade for economic progress through tourism. Today, these types of public declarations and institutional performances show how the state continues reinforcing the ideology of a modern nation in which the Maya civilization is the origin of all Guatemalans, regardless of their race, class, or gender, and that it should be used to generate profit for progress. The invisibility and denial of indigenous populations in the construction of Guatemalan nationalist discourse were hegemonic, violent, patriarchal, and racist political actions. These processes impose a homogeneous model that will facilitate the union of the nation, erasing the diversity and complexity of histories already existing in this territory prior to a Spanish invasion. As I said at the beginning, when I lived in Cotzal, I learned about the multiplicity of relationships people have with what I was framing exclusively as classic or post-classic sites. I realized that by embracing Ixil ontologies to study the past, I was situating my work politically, engaged with the defense of Ixil history. This guides me to address the ways the Ixil nonlinear time and spirituality intersects with their resilience. The Ixil people conceptualize their origins through Kumol ancestry or Ixil ancestry. This concept used by the Kumpares or Balbaltiosh, which are the spiritual guides and the ancestral authorities, is mainly built on Maya spirituality and memory. And it is closely tied to the Nachombal and Totzotzcuicumam. The first, Nachombal, are the spatial extensions for Kumol ancestry, conceptualized as places containing special energies for the Maya ceremonies. The Ixil spiritual practice and memory is the conduit that people have been using to maintain and transmit this knowledge over generations. The Totzotzcuicumam are the reference to the house of the Ixil grandparents, or what I was designated as archaeological site. The Nachombal and Totzotzcuicumam for what I call the constellation of memory, which refers to the processes in which the inhabitants have been interweaving generationally an intimate relationship with the landscape, spirituality, the memory of the civil war that occurred from 1960 to 1996, and the materials remains of the first settlements in the region. Within this background, I discuss the forms that the constellation of memory challenge the national narratives, but also the conventional ways of practicing archaeological research. The intersection of ancestry, rituality, and memory can be found through Ixil spiritual practices and the study of archaeological materiality. As phenomena present across the Maya highlands, giving attention to this intersection is essential when doing research as a way to visualize how local epistemologies are intrinsic to local political projects of decolonization. In this case, the Ixil ancestral authorities, Kumpares, and members of the Ixil University place their epistemologies as central in their fight when challenging various forms of extractivism. The Ixil nonlinear approach of time challenges the Guatemala racist narratives, since it represents a constant revisiting of the origins during the Maya ceremonies and daily life, which are available at the Nachombal and Totzotzcuicumam. People have access to the past from the present through memory. For instance, when talking about the ancestors or practicing spirituality. The collective memory for the Ixil people is their medium to connect to their past. In the Ixil Maya world vision, the practice of their spirituality is essential to maintaining the Tichahil, an Ixil philosophy of the good life or a life in balance. According to the spiritual guides, the Nachombal are special places in which Kumpares and people can offer specific intentions to the energies that maintains the balance of the world. Nachombal are interrelated, forming a web across the Maya territories. Every Nachbal has its own energy, and when the Cumpares conduct Maya ceremonies, they are calling the energies of every sacred place in their territory to be present at the moment of the offering. The Ixil ceremonial language is another channel to circulate historical memory within sacred and historical domains. According to Maria Luz Garcia, the prayers chanted during the ceremonies of reburial of the victims' exhumes from clandestine tombs are local ways of talking about the violence. The reintegration of the deceased is part of a post-genocide community reconstruction, in which the circulation of collective memory has an essential role. Ixil spirituality is a practice that calls upon the energy of the creators of the world and the first ancestors so they can be present and in the Maya ceremony every time it is practiced. By calling these energies to ask for blessings, advice, permission, forgiveness, or to reintegrate the victims of the civil war into the community, the Cumpares maintain their memory, which is rooted in the origin of the sacred fire. Despite the period of the violence, the looting, the destruction, the decrease of the Cumpares, and imposition of evangelical beliefs, Ixils continue weaving the social fabric of their memory, and their spiritual practices is one channel to do so. The Tototskuykumam is one of the various places of reference to the grandmothers and grandfathers. These are not mere archaeological sites. Their significance goes beyond the actual materiality of the ancient settlement. These are proper places to practice Maya ceremony, given that the remains of the old houses contain the energy of the effort that their ancestors left for future generations. Tototskuykumam translates as the house of the grandparents, the mam. And since the Maya Ixil linguistic group derives from the Proto-Mamian, when people say Kuykumam, they are pointing out the mam group as their direct relation to the ancestry. The Ixil nonlinear time positions them in close relationship to their ancestry. Every time someone visits the Nachombal or calls the energies of these places, the energy and memory of the ancestors is intentionally brought to the present. Thus, the connection of the past is available whenever someone needs it through memory, and spiritual practices allow access to these energies. Authors refers to the nonlinear time as circular, spiral, past-future, or future-present, as descriptions of the processes of recreation and transformation, of returning to primordial energies and the way that memory and ancestry created a channel to access diverse points in the past, but also as feedback of contemporaneity articulating the present, future, and past. Kumo ancestry is a very particular standpoint, contrary to the normative uses of the idea of ancient Maya, seen in the official history, popular media, and touristic advertisement. The concept of ancestry has turned into a commodity for national political purposes, alluding to a distant past alien to the contemporary world. It continues gaining popularity nationally and worldwide through neoliberal campaigns. For instance, in Guatemala, ancestry's discourse was used by the oligarchy, an exclusive upper-class Ladino male group, and owners of the country's biggest companies. The most prominent supermarket chain owner in the country has an extensive private collection of looted pre-classic, classic, and post-classic Maya vessels, artifacts, and stelae. He promotes creating a private museum called Museo Maya de América, or Maya Museum of the Americas, to display his private collection publicly. The campaign uses notions of ancestry to encourage donors and the general public and support the construction of such museum. One of the campaign's videos says, quote, "And the voices of our ancestors tell stories of a proud history 3,000 years old. Your past calls you. Join the symphony of civilization." End quote. This advertisement recalls the national ideology of appropriation of the Mayas as the ancestors of all Guatemalans. One of the greatest dangers of this narrative is that it renders invisible the diversity of indigenous groups living in the country, denies their existence, and erases the country's prevailing complex racial power dynamics. Within this frame, the political fight of the Ixil ancestral authorities is a collective effort to incorporate their history, their identity, and epistemologies, surrounded by colonial impositions, like public education, extractive industries, religious beliefs, or museum campaigns. Thus, the Ixil reference to ancestry highlight the intrinsic relationship they have built over generations to their territory, to their history, memory, spirituality, culture, and identity. Ixil's demands are a clear statement of an ongoing political challenge and resilience to maintain the Tichajil in a country where indigenous peoples are continuously facing social inequality and exclusion at multiple scales. These efforts are not happening just in the Ixil region. There are many other communities, Maya and Xinca, in Guatemala who are fighting against these multinational companies, especially those extracting silver and nickel. Several indigenous leaders are also fighting against the state that criminalizes them by defending their lands. Okay, final remarks. We integrated local ontologies and a mapping program of ancestral sites of Cotzal within an active political struggle of land defense. The constellation of memory of Cotzal show us the entanglements among spiritual ways of living the world and the ancestral knowledge maintained by daily practices, the historical memory of invasions and the civil war, and the recent struggles against mega projects. Our mapping is an example that decolonization of archaeology in Guatemala is possible through collaboration and political engagement. The request from the ancestral authorities that brought me to research the post-classic sites of Cotzal meant a deep transformation at a personal and professional levels. This experience allowed me to see the overall dynamics from a mestizo perspective, writing the indigenous history, and the risks and dangers of reproducing coloniality by not addressing the politics of knowledge production and how such knowledge has been used in the country. Therefore, my work is an engaged research from a mestiza positionality that is inquiring the intrinsic relationships between national racist ideologies and the archaeological practices, aware of the historical context of violence, displacement, exploitation, and extractivism in Guatemala at a large scale and in specific at Cotzal. In this talk, I have argued that research in the past should integrate archaeological theorizations based on the material evidence and indigenous epistemologies, such as the Ixil ways of knowing that place spirituality at the core. Both perspectives can benefit from one another. One provides material evidence of human occupation in the region, and the other is shaped over generations and shows the complexity of relationships between the territory, and the people living within it. The importance of weaving both approaches to understand the past is to not exclude the Ixil knowledge regarding their sacred landscape. Examining the points of divergence guide our understanding of the role that intellectuals have had in the creation of national discourses and legislation over the cultural heritage, but also to build awareness of the value of memory, spirituality, oral history, and local epistemologies when we do research. Thank you very much.
Adriana, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, fantastic. Maybe I'll take a minute to ask the first question, Adriana. Firstly, your talk was so beautiful and so rich. I mean, it really, it was almost perfect to me in the way that you stuck to your topic, but the parallels and the resonances and points of divergence, as you said, you were talking specifically within your context between different notions of history, but frankly, those same kinds of points of divergence and convergence exist when we look at here in North America, when we look elsewhere in the world. So it was just beautifully done. Thank you. I had a specific question. Gosh, I first started thinking about time long ago as a graduate student in anthropology. I was reading certainly not a decolonized work of anthropology. I was reading E. Evans Pritchard's New Era book, classic ethnography on the New Era, and he made an offhanded comment in that book somewhere that all notions of time are cultural or social notions, that they're all arbitrary divisions of time. He was thinking about a very different context of New Era time. And I think frankly, that comment for him was really echoing back to Durkheim. So these are ideas that go back to the founding of anthropology, but it was such an intriguing point because I'd never thought about why we divide time into 24 hours, into 365 days, why we have leap years. Oh, those are all actually, cultural divisions. Yeah. Time has no, in and of itself is an unmarked thing, and it's human beings who mark it, whether we make it a linear thing or a circular thing. And it really started to get me thinking in new ways, the beauty of anthropology, I guess. But my question would be, maybe it got towards this at the very end, but throughout your talk, I was wondering, how would you map these two kinds of time against each other? How would you compare them? So for example, as an archaeologist, you might have started with this division of time between the classic and the post-classic, right? And all the subdivisions. And then you're confronted by a different way of thinking about time, as a circular one. But how do you go? Do you just abandon the archaeological divisions of time entirely? Do you try to juxtapose them? How do you do that in practice? It's hard, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks for your question. Yeah, this is something that I struggle a lot. Because I found myself holding this rigid idea of time, like in a linear perspective, like this is 2000 years old, this is 1000 years old, and concentrating in how old or like how separated it is from the present. It was hard for me to detach from that knowledge, because obviously we live in this type of organizing time, basically. And this is maybe one of the pillars of archaeology. So when I found out about other forms of relating to time and approaching past way different than the archaeological perspective, it was for me, yeah, of course it was challenging. but I mean, I embrace it as a way to respect that way of negotiating time and the relationship with time, yeah, which is also related to spirituality. So it's hard still because I wasn't born in that community, and that is not my culture. I was born in the city, so I kind of try to compare and like this is a spiral, this is circular or non-linear, and this is linear. And I found that it's the best way to handle is to try to conversate, place both approaches in the same level, and like talking like how the nonlinear time speaks to or informs to the archaeological ways of seeing the past, and the opposite way as well. So rather than putting them like in a fight, or just putting them in conversation to see how they inform each other, right? This is one thing. And the other is embracing this knowledge, learning these issue ways of seeing the world, allow me to identify the power dynamics of history, basically, and how archaeology is immersed in that. So that's why I think it's very important to address these different approaches to history, to past, to time.
Yeah, you laid that out really beautifully. It's that laying those next to each other, seeing the points of divergence that allow you to see the power dynamics and the racism, the colonialism of what seems to us just taken for granted, this Western linear notion of time. I mean, look, we all knew to show up at 2 p.m. right? We knew to show up for your talk at a moment in time. We're embedded in it. It's inescapable in a way, right? But yet, what's beautiful here is that you're able, by laying these next to each other, you're able to start to kind of critique the taken for granted, and that's, to me,
yeah. And I want to add something there. Yeah, it's like opening the space for a richer conversation. It's like seeing that there is not just one way to see the past, as you said at the beginning. Time is a perception that reflects culture, like particular groups of people around the world, particular relationships to the nature, etc. So if we open that conversation, like, is recognizing that there is not just one way, and the way that we have taken for granted has taken power and imposed, basically has imposed that hegemonic view over multiple world views.
Let me switch now. We've got questions coming in, which is fantastic. So I hope you have time to take some questions. This is from Mayra Arza. I'd like to ask what conversations are being placed in the concept of non-Maya peoples, calling them, quote, our ancestors in the archaeology field. This is something I've heard from archaeologists before, defending themselves by saying, quote, who owns the ancestors? Thank you. So,
okay.
Got it.
So this question it's very important because it refers us to the politics or intersectionality, I'll say, recognizing where in society we are, not just the class part or the class aspect. We have to consider the gender aspect, the ethnic and the race aspect, and many other identity markers. And I'll talk from my experience from mestizo positionality. I was born and raised in a mestizo family in the city, middle class family with access to education. And basically in Guatemala, well, I haven't found enough places to talk about that, about identity and how we navigate identity politics when we research. For example, mestizo person researching indigenous communities. So, or non-Maya, depends how the people, or Latino, or United States people, like foreign people, studying the other. That's why I'm addressing this literature about otherness and coloniality, basically. So it has been complicated because this is complex, of course. Talking openly about identity politics when we do research. And curiously, I have found more interest here in the United States to talk about this compared to my colleagues in Guatemala. Because, of course, it's complicated and it can touch personal sentiments, but it's our practice. So I think we need to talk about it openly and think it critically about what does it mean for a non-Indigenous person researching within Indigenous communities, and what is the relationship, like how the research is done, basically. I mean, there are many other stuff, but I would leave it there.
Yeah, there's a lot there, isn't there? Let me see. I guess actually it looks like this is the same question twice. Is that right? Okay, I think the same question. Sorry, I was trying to catch up and listen to what you're saying, so I wanted to catch both. You know, I think I've maybe said this before, but I was a student of Michel Rolfe-Trouillot at Chicago, and as a graduate student, and his work really kind of intersects with what you're talking about in an interesting way, because he's not looking at archaeology or anthropological forms of knowledge. He was thinking, though, about the way that any narrative about the past displaces or silences alternate narratives. So it really is the same kind of dynamic where the question becomes, who has the power to impose their narrative about the past and therefore displace other narratives? It's not even a conscious, his argument was in Silencing the Past, the book Silencing the Past, wasn't even necessarily a conscious effort, a deliberate effort at all. It was just something that would happen when you put forward a certain narrative about the past, that other narratives are pushed aside or silenced, right? And in really profoundly, what you're showing, I think, is a archaeological version of that same thing, a story about the archaeological past. And you put out, how did you put it really well, that, you know, it's the Kumal, I think, ancestry versus ancient Maya, the archaeological ancient Maya, the linear way of talking about the past. It does exactly this. It silences those other narratives. And there, of course, there are infinite number of possible narratives about the past out there, and no one has time to hear them all. And so what happens is, perhaps not intentionally, but profoundly violent to those other alternative narratives, and you're recuperating those. That's not perhaps a comment, but I wonder, that does, I loved how you circled, or you've sort of framed this around an active political struggle. Could you talk a little more about that, the political struggle, and how you see your work contributing? I think you said you were invited to do this research as by elders as a way of helping them to make a political struggle. Do you have an example or two you could give us to kind of round that out a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, this is related to the previous question of Mayra, and I'll try to mix both. So I met the ancestral authorities of San Juan Cotzal, which are not the same as the like governmental authorities. These ancestral, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
The ancestral authorities are like recognized and acknowledged by the communities, several communities in the Ixil region, and they have been organizing for a long time, and they are one of the main political objectives of them is to recover Tichajil, which is, as I said in the presentation, an Ixil philosophy of the good life. It's also has been compared to the Abiyala, you know, the living well in life in balance. So that means that they are fighting for their history, their culture, identity, for their land, recovering of their land, and against imposition, external impositions. So in this framework, current framework, that they are struggling with the mega project that is in Cotzal in the territory, which is a hydroelectric plant that was built without consultation to communities. They established, after they built the hydroelectric plant in 2011, a little bit before that, they established like an open table between the ancestral authorities, the government, and the company to talk about this, why they didn't consult the ancestral authorities and the communities around. And they started this open conversation that continued for years, and the company take off, like leave the conversation, abandon, that's the legal word, abandon the conversation. So the communities in Cotzal, led by the ancestral authorities, they are looking for tools, like external tools, to bring into their fight. So they saw in archaeology one tool, like one device that can contribute to this fight against the mega project. Mm-hmm. So when we met in 2012, they saw like a good source of information in archaeology to prove that they have been there for a long time, that these archaeological sites and sacred sites are of their grandparents. So they wanted to use archaeology to present this, institutional legitimized knowledge, which is that is archaeology, to present this to the legal space or the legal, environment as an evidence, like they have the study, archaeological study, and we can continue with this process of negotiation with the multinational, for example. But this is not the only way they want to use archaeological information. They are bringing the history or the perspective that archaeology can give when mapping, for example, mapping the archaeological sites into their Ixil University classes. Also as a way to socialize with the spiritual guides, for example, all the places, like they are interested in what archaeology can say about the sites. So it's about political claiming of territory, it's about identity, it's about educational approach too. So yeah. So through this, I was exposed to all of this engagement with history, right? As well, I was like asked many times, what are you doing here in Cotzal? As you are like, sometimes I found people who didn't want me there because what I represent as mestiza body, you know, from the city. And that's where I started addressing the politics of archaeological knowledge production, because people directly say to me, you, as many other anthropologists, you are here just to extract our knowledge. You're gonna leave the town and you're gonna be like putting this knowledge out in the world, and nothing is gonna be beneficial for like from out of this work. So I went through different stages, many conversations, many meetings with the spiritual guides, with several people to, and we were talking about these issues. Like I was very committed to work with them and being as much honest and transparent in this process to not reproduce coloniality. That's why it is important for me to address the positionality in the research.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you had multiple perspectives from different community members, and okay, so it's a great answer. Thank you. I see that we have some more questions that have come in, and I want to get to them. I have plenty of time. I hope you do, but I don't know if everyone wants to. Firstly, actually, Michael Brown asked a question that kind of overlaps. Let's see here if if maybe you've addressed enough of that in that answer, but great talk, Adriana. Can you talk a bit more about how the collaborative process you discuss is changing archaeological theory and understanding of the Maya? You have just elaborated the collaborative process, but do you see ways it's changing archaeological theory?
It could change, but that requires a lot of critical engagement with collaborative approaches, in the sense that producing theory just from one side, like, for example, I'm going to talk about post-classic sites and what the archaeological evidence, what the materiality says based on the archaeological framework. So the openness will be what the elders say about this materiality, and building these bridges, like building the history together. Not just not just the archaeologist talking about the materiality and bringing this like a source, but building it together. I think that's the biggest challenge when theorizing about the past. Open the archaeological theoretical frameworks to other voices. And that means many people, not just the archaeologists talking about it. Yeah. And the collaborative, so that's like equal to a large, long process, like for years, of talking about these things, like in a program, permanently, and indigenous members, like community members of the community, doing it. I mean, yeah, they have to do it. I mean, at some point, they won't need archaeologists like from the outside, because they have it there. That's their own history. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, that it will take the collaborative approach that is decolonizing. So yeah, in methods, it will be a lot of conversations, meetings, being flexible to not stick with one schedule and like rigid schedule or one way to do the things, always consultating, being honest about all the process. And this is very interesting because at the beginning, when we started talking about what we were gonna research, when they requested my participation in their processes, I had to explain all the processes of archaeological research from basic, this is what we do. If we make excavations, we have to dig. I have to explain all the processes and what the laws, what is the legal framework for the archaeological practice in Guatemala. And when they knew that all the materials extracted from the ground were gonna be translated to Guatemala, like mobilize them to the city for the museum or the Minister of Culture, they said, no, why you are taking that away from our town? So, because that's the law, that's the requirement, and you have to ask permission to the state as an archaeologist to even map and to conduct excavations. So they said, no, we are not doing any excavations because what it's in the ground has to be there, has to stay there. This is sacred. We are not going to touch it. So that represented for me a limit to research the past, because archaeology relies a lot on excavations for a very narrowed question, research question. We have to dig, we have to excavate. Otherwise, it's very difficult to talk about particularities of the history. So that was another challenge for me, because if we were not going to do excavations, we needed to do something less extractive. And we ended up doing the post-classic mapping of the sites. So in that sense, for me, I realized that I had to be flexible with that and not impose my own agenda, research agenda, accommodate it.
Adriana, as again, there's so many parallels to say, for example, here, archaeological practice today in the Southwest, and we've had other programs on that, so I won't go into that. I want to get back. We have more questions coming in. This is great. Keep them coming. Go back to one from Victor Castillo. Could you expand on the ancestral relationships between the Ichil and the Mam? I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing this well, Adriana. Zakaleu, the ancient capital of the Mam, shares many archaeological traits with the Ixil region during the Classic period. Expand on the ancestral relationships between Ichil and the Mam.
Yeah, so I'll explain from Ichil point of view of that relationship, and is that when they were teaching me about their grandparents, as I said in the presentation, all the references to their ancestors, like the old grandparents and grandfathers, grandmothers, were to the Mam. All the references were like, our ancestors are Mam, because, and that's when I learned about the meaning of archaeological sites. The totots, which are houses in Ichil, and Cuicumam, the great grandparents from the Mam linguistic group. So it's this relationship about their neighbors nowadays, the neighbors, the Mam, and not related directly to other sites, like other classic archaeological sites in other parts of the country, but directly, but they don't mention any other site. They just gave me this example of the grandparents. So I was questioning myself that why they didn't expand more on that, because so what I think is that many spiritual guides were clear about not giving certain information, and some others gave me like the information I could share with more people. So I didn't push people to give me more information because I knew like I was treating with respect all of this. So I didn't go deeper into this topic of like what type of relationship they had. And from the archaeological, this is from the issue standpoint. And from the archaeological standpoint, it's like all the studies that as the who Victor Castillo asked, has been studying about the different interactions from classic times. And it could be like from even pre-classic. And this is something that I wanna study in the future based on ceramics with particular ceramic traditions that start in what is now Chiapas, which is to the west. So how these linguistic groups are, or this group, sorry, this ethnic group are moving from the western side of Huehuetenango or Chiapas now coming into the Maya highlands, like south, more south, and how that migration is reflected in ceramics. But this is for the future.
Sounds good. We have another great question. I'll make sure you get these texts, full questions from the Q&A, so you can talk about it more, think about it more later. So I need to condense just a little. This is from a fellow SAR fellow, Clint Bergio Erickson. Adriana, I greatly appreciate your critique of the political implications of archaeology in the context of Guatemala. The parallels to other settler colonial states are many. Absolutely. I have two questions. Clint's first question, I believe you've already addressed at this point to some degree. So I want to go straight to the second question. Again, I'll make sure you get it. Hopefully you and Clint can talk more. Clint, and I'm sorry to shorten it like this, but I do think she's covered that pretty well. And I hope you'll continue chatting in person. So question, how do you approach communicating and sharing your work with collaborative communities? How do you bring back the results of work, such as this talk, in ways that are accessible and relevant to your community partners?
Yeah, good. Thank you, Clint. Yeah, there are very different layers because starting with this talk, it's in English. So it's, I mean, it's not fair to share the knowledge, the writing I'm creating and the knowledge I'm creating in this way. But I have asked them to join, for example, the dissertation defense I had 3 months ago. So this is one way. So I'm always sharing and asking like the approaches I'm doing by like right now, for example, basically asking permission. So and this is from the beginning, when I was doing my fieldwork research in Cotzal, after living there like for almost 1.5 years, I didn't want to leave the town before presenting the results of what I did till then. So we had a lot of meetings during the time I was there because I was involved in all their activities. So the ancestral authorities were very open, and they said, you have to be here with us. Even though it's not related to your research, you come. And they invited me to everything. So I was really active within their activities, many kinds, many type of activities. So we were constantly talking about what I was doing. So yeah, that was one level that like we had this constant conversation all the time because I was living there, I was participating in their activities, even though I didn't understand Ishil because it's so hard to learn the language. I was learning it. I understood some words, but I couldn't like fully understood everything. Although they were talking all the time in Ishil, I was there like just speaking some words, and they like embrace my presence there. So that was like the day-to-day relationship. But of course, there were other settings, like more formal, in which I presented them the preliminary results of what I did. We made a small book with all the data we collected, and they have it there. It's in Spanish. So the goal is to, when I go back to Guatemala, one of the main things we want to do is to sit together to keep revising the data and write together. Well, I want to find a scholarship to fund the issue translation of what I write in Spanish, so they can use it as they want. So that is that's the way I'm bridging the written products of my research.
That's terrific. I think that leads right to what I believe is our last question, if you have a little more time. And this is, again, it's a follow-up question from Mayra Arzate. Thank you, Adriana. If I may ask another question, are you planning to become a professor and mentor when you obtain your PhD? Because I'd like to study under your guidance. It's the first time I hear of these conversations in the open, and I honor you for your professionalism and dedication in between the community and the academic worlds. So I guess the question in there is, are you planning to become a professor and mentor?
Thank you. Yes, I want to be professor. I want to keep doing research. Yeah, so yes, that's the plan, but it's hard. I mean, it's, yeah.
Yes, it's a hard field, we know. Well, it was this. Thank you so much. Wonderful presentation and wonderful questions and answers. I hope that the rest of this year goes well. We'll look forward to more conversations here at SAR. And for folks joining us, thank you for joining. Thank you for your questions. I do hope I've gotten to everything. And if not, please email us. Wait, there's one more in the chat. Let me make sure this is redundant. Oh, it's just a comment. This is not a question. It was a comment. Looking forward to being able to see this again with the recording link. That's correct. Those of you who have registered, you'll receive a link in a few days once we've gotten this processed to be able to see this recording again. Adriana, thank you so much. This was a wonderful way to end this year's colloquia series, and keep at it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks all SAR members and the Paloheimo Foundation for this opportunity.
Okay, terrific. Gonna
Bye.
log off now. Okay.